Few philosophers in history have left as profound and controversial a legacy as Friedrich Nietzsche, a thinker whose ideas challenged the very foundations of Western thought. Nietzsche's influence extends far beyond philosophy, shaping fields such as psychology, literature, politics, and even popular culture. His radical critiques of morality, religion, and traditional metaphysics positioned him as one of the most provocative figures in intellectual history. While his works were often misunderstood, misinterpreted, and even misused, particularly in the political sphere, his writings continue to inspire and challenge readers in the modern world. To understand Nietzsche is to engage with some of the most fundamental questions of human existence. What is the nature of truth? How should we live? What does it mean to be free? Born in 1844 in Aachen, Germany, Nietzsche exhibited an exceptional intellect from a young age. Initially destined for a career in theology, he abandoned religious studies early in life and pursued philology, the study of ancient languages and texts. His sharp mind and relentless pursuit of knowledge led him to an academic career at the remarkably young age of 24, when he became a professor at the University of Basel. However, Nietzsche's intellectual journey would soon take a radical turn, as he began to question the very foundations of the disciplines he had studied. Nietzsche's most famous contributions to philosophy came in the form of scathing critiques of morality and religion, particularly Christianity. He viewed traditional moral values as repressive constructs that hindered human potential, promoting weakness rather than strength. His proclamation that God is dead was not a mere atheistic declaration, but rather a statement about the decline of religious authority in modern society. In Nietzsche's view, the collapse of traditional religious beliefs necessitated the creation of new values, ones that would affirm life rather than negate it. This idea would become central to his philosophy, culminating in concepts such as the Übermensch, Overman, and the will to power. Despite his brilliance, Nietzsche's life was marked by struggle, both physically and psychologically. He suffered from chronic illness throughout his life, which forced him to abandon his academic career and live in near isolation. During these years, however, he produced some of his most groundbreaking works, including Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Beyond Good and Evil, and On the Genealogy of Morality. These writings were radical for their time and remain challenging even today, as they call for a complete reevaluation of morality, truth, and human potential. One of Nietzsche's most enduring contributions to philosophy is his critique of absolute truth. He argued that what we consider truth is not an objective reality, but rather a series of interpretations shaped by history, power, and language. His perspectivism, a theory suggesting that all knowledge is influenced by perspective, foreshadowed many ideas later developed by existentialist and postmodern thinkers. In rejecting the notion of objective truth, Nietzsche opened the door for an entirely new way of understanding human knowledge and existence. However, Nietzsche's ideas were not without controversy. His concept of the will to power, the driving force behind all human ambition and creativity, was later misappropriated by fascist ideologies, particularly by the Nazis, despite Nietzsche's own rejection of nationalism and anti-Semitism. His sister, Elisabeth Forster Nietzsche, played a significant role in distorting his legacy by selectively editing his works to align with her far-right views. As a result, Nietzsche's philosophy was wrongly associated with totalitarianism, an association that scholars have since worked hard to correct. Nietzsche's influence on modern thought is immeasurable. His writings laid the foundation for existentialism, influencing philosophers such as Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, and Martin Heidegger. His critiques of morality and power dynamics found resonance in the works of Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida, who build upon Nietzsche's ideas in their deconstructions of societal structures. Even in psychology, Nietzsche's insights into human drives and self-deception anticipated many of Sigmund Freud's theories on the unconscious mind. Beyond academia, Nietzsche's ideas have permeated literature, art, and culture. Writers such as Fyodor Dostoevsky and Thomas Mann engaged deeply with his philosophy, while his concepts of the Übermensch and eternal recurrence have found their way into everything from films and novels to modern self-improvement movements. His challenge to conventional morality continues to inspire those who seek to break free from societal norms and forge their own paths. Despite the complexity of his philosophy, Nietzsche's core message remains deeply relevant today: the call to self-overcoming. He urged individuals to break free from imposed values and create their own meaning in a world devoid of inherent purpose. This radical freedom comes with immense responsibility, as it demands the courage to face life's uncertainties without relying on external authorities. In a world still grappling with questions of meaning, morality, and individual autonomy, Nietzsche's philosophy continues to provide both a challenge and a guide. This dissertation will explore Nietzsche's life and ideas in greater depth, tracing his intellectual development from his early years as a philologist to his final days of mental collapse. By examining his most important works and their philosophical significance, we will gain a deeper understanding of his contributions to modern thought. Nietzsche's legacy is one of both brilliance and tragedy, a man who sought to free humanity from outdated constraints but ultimately paid the price of isolation and madness. Yet, even in his final, incoherent letters, there is a glimpse of the boundless energy and creative force that defined his work. To study Nietzsche is to engage with a mind that, even in its darkest moments, burned with an unrelenting passion for truth, power, and the affirmation of life. Friedrich Nietzsche was born on October 15, 1844, in the small town of Rocken, in the Prussian province of Saxony, modern-day Germany. His family belonged to a long line of Lutheran pastors, and his father, Karl Ludwig Nietzsche, was himself a minister. This deeply religious environment played a crucial role in shaping Nietzsche's early worldview, as he was initially immersed in Christian teachings and expected to follow in the footsteps of his ancestors. However, his intellectual journey would eventually lead him far from the faith of his upbringing, culminating in a radical critique of Christianity that would become one of the cornerstones of his philosophy. Tragedy struck Nietzsche's life at an early age. When he was just 5 years old, his father died from a brain ailment, leaving his mother, Franziska Nietzsche, to raise Friedrich and his younger sister, Elizabeth, alone. Shortly thereafter, his younger brother, Ludwig, also passed away. These early experiences with loss and suffering may have contributed to Nietzsche's later existential concerns, particularly his reflections on fate, suffering, and the meaning of life. Despite these hardships, young Nietzsche excelled academically, showing remarkable intellectual potential from a very early age. In 1858, Nietzsche was accepted into Schulpforta, an elite boarding school known for its rigorous classical curriculum. There, he developed a profound appreciation for literature, history, and ancient languages, particularly Greek and Latin. His time at Schulpforta was instrumental in shaping his scholarly discipline, as he became deeply engrossed in the works of classical philosophers, poets, and playwrights. He was particularly drawn to the writings of the pre-Socratic philosophers such as Heraclitus and Empedocles, whose radical ideas about change and the nature of existence would later influence his own thinking. During his teenage years, Nietzsche also displayed an early fascination with music. He was a talented pianist and composer, and he harbored ambitions of pursuing a career in music. This passion for music would later manifest in his philosophical writings, particularly in his discussions of art and aesthetics. His love for Richard Wagner's operas in particular would play a significant role in his intellectual development, as Wagner initially served as both a mentor and an inspiration before their eventual ideological rift. After completing his studies at Schulpforta, Nietzsche enrolled at the University of Bonn in 1864, initially studying theology and classical philology. However, his time at Bonn was short-lived, as he quickly became disillusioned with religious studies and abandoned theology entirely. His loss of faith was a pivotal moment in his intellectual journey, as he began to question not only Christian doctrine, but also the broader moral and metaphysical assumptions of Western thought. This skepticism would later develop into one of the most radical critiques of religion in modern philosophy. In 1865, Nietzsche transferred to the University of Leipzig, where he continued his studies in philology under the guidance of Friedrich Wilhelm Ritschl, a respected scholar in the field. It was in Leipzig that Nietzsche encountered the works of Arthur Schopenhauer, whose philosophy had a profound impact on him. Schopenhauer's pessimistic view of existence, his concept of the will to life, and his critique of conventional morality resonated deeply with Nietzsche. Although Nietzsche would later distance himself from Schopenhauer's metaphysics, this early exposure to his ideas helped shape Nietzsche's own philosophical direction. Another intellectual revelation came when Nietzsche discovered the writings of Charles Darwin. The theory of evolution and its implications for human nature fascinated him, as it provided a naturalistic explanation for the development of life without the need for divine intervention. While Nietzsche did not fully embrace Darwinism in a scientific sense, he incorporated evolutionary ideas into his own philosophy, particularly in his discussions on power, struggle, and the development of human values. Nietzsche's academic brilliance did not go unnoticed. At the age of 24, he was offered a professorship in classical philology at the University of Basel in Switzerland, a remarkable achievement for someone so young. He accepted the position in 1869, despite not having completed his doctoral dissertation. The university granted him a doctorate based on the strength of his published works and his academic reputation. This marked the beginning of Nietzsche's professional career, but it also signaled the beginning of his intellectual transition away from philology toward philosophy. During his time in Basel, Nietzsche maintained friendships with some of the most prominent intellectuals of the time, including the historian Jacob Burckhardt and the composer Richard Wagner. His association with Wagner, in particular, had a profound influence on him, as he saw in Wagner's music a powerful expression of the Dionysian artistic spirit that he admired. However, as Nietzsche's philosophical views evolved, his admiration for Wagner turned into sharp criticism, leading to one of the most famous intellectual breakups in history. Nietzsche's early years in education laid the foundation for the radical philosophical ideas he would later develop. His rigorous training in classical philology gave him the analytical tools to dissect language and meaning, while his exposure to Schopenhauer, Darwin, and Wagner provided him with intellectual material that would shape his own worldview. Although he began his career as a scholar of ancient texts, it was clear that Nietzsche was destined for something far greater. His mind was restless, questioning, and unwilling to accept traditional dogmas. As he moved forward in his career, his journey would take him beyond academia and into the realm of groundbreaking philosophical thought. In 1869, at the remarkably young age of 24, Friedrich Nietzsche was appointed as a professor of classical philology at the University of Basel in Switzerland. His rapid rise to academic prominence was an extraordinary achievement, as he was granted the position without having completed a formal doctoral dissertation. Instead, his exceptional scholarly work and reputation as a brilliant thinker were enough to secure the post. His tenure at Basel marked a crucial period in his intellectual development, during which he expanded his interests beyond philology and began engaging deeply with philosophy, music, and cultural criticism. At Basel, Nietzsche found himself among some of the most respected intellectuals of the time, including the historian Jacob Burckhardt, whose works on classical antiquity and Renaissance culture left a lasting impression on him. Burckhardt's emphasis on cultural history and his critique of modernity resonated with Nietzsche, who was beginning to see the contemporary world as one plagued by stagnation and decadence. The intellectual environment at Basel provided Nietzsche with a platform to refine his ideas, even as he became increasingly disillusioned with the rigid methodologies of philology. Although Nietzsche was an outstanding scholar of ancient texts, he gradually became dissatisfied with the constraints of traditional philological studies. He felt that academic philology was too focused on textual analysis and historical accuracy, often neglecting the broader philosophical and existential questions that he found more pressing. His frustration with academia would eventually push him toward independent philosophical inquiry, leading him to produce works that departed from conventional scholarship and instead aimed at a radical reevaluation of culture, morality, and human existence. During this period, Nietzsche formed a deep and complex relationship with the composer Richard Wagner, who was at the height of his fame. Wagner was more than just a composer to Nietzsche. He represented the possibility of a cultural renewal, a figure who could restore the lost greatness of Greek tragedy and create a new artistic vision for the modern world. Nietzsche admired Wagner's music for its emotional intensity and its ability to evoke a sense of Dionysian ecstasy, an idea that would play a central role in his first major book, The Birth of Tragedy. In The Birth of Tragedy, published in 1872, Nietzsche proposed that Greek tragedy had reached its peak through the fusion of two opposing artistic forces, the Apollonian and the Dionysian. The Apollonian represented order, reason, and structure, while the Dionysian embodied chaos, passion, and primal instinct. Nietzsche argued that the decline of Greek tragedy came with the rise of Socratic rationalism, which emphasized logic and reason at the expense of artistic and emotional depth. He saw Wagner's operas as a potential revival of the Dionysian spirit in modern art, though his later disillusionment with Wagner would lead him to revise this view. Despite the originality of The Birth of Tragedy, the book was poorly received by scholars of classical studies, many of whom criticized Nietzsche for his unorthodox approach and lack of rigorous philological method. His departure from strict academic scholarship in favor of broader philosophical speculation alienated many of his colleagues. However, Nietzsche was not concerned with pleasing traditional academics. He was more interested in challenging conventional wisdom and pushing the boundaries of thought. The negative reception of his work only reinforced his belief that contemporary academia was failing to address the deeper cultural and existential crises of the modern world. Nietzsche's time at Basel was also marked by increasing health problems. He suffered from debilitating migraines, digestive issues, and episodes of severe exhaustion. These health struggles, which had plagued him since his youth, worsened over the years and began to interfere with his ability to teach and conduct research. As his physical condition deteriorated, so too did his patience for the academic life. The demands of university teaching became increasingly burdensome, and he longed for the freedom to pursue his philosophical ideas without institutional constraints. In 1876, after years of struggling with his health, Nietzsche took a leave of absence from the university. By 1879, his condition had worsened to the point that he was forced to resign from his professorship entirely. Though his formal academic career had come to an end, this period of transition marked the beginning of his most productive philosophical phase. Free from the expectations of university life, Nietzsche embraced a life of solitude and intellectual independence, dedicating himself fully to the pursuit of his philosophical vision. Despite leaving academia, Nietzsche's intellectual output during this time was extraordinary. He continued to write and refine his ideas, developing some of the key concepts that would later define his philosophy, such as the will to power, the Übermensch, and the critique of morality. His departure from Basel was not a retreat from intellectual life, but rather a necessary step toward the radical originality that would characterize his later works. Nietzsche's years at Basel were formative in multiple ways. They provided him with the intellectual environment to refine his ideas, the personal relationships that would shape his thinking, and the growing realization that he needed to break away from institutional constraints in order to fully develop his philosophy. His transition from a promising young scholar to an independent and radical thinker was now complete. Although his formal career as a professor had ended, his philosophical journey was only just beginning. Friedrich Nietzsche's intellectual development was profoundly shaped by two towering figures of 19th-century thought: the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer and the composer Richard Wagner. Both men exerted a significant influence on Nietzsche's early ideas, inspiring him to think deeply about art, culture, and the human condition. However, as Nietzsche's philosophy matured, he grew increasingly critical of both Schopenhauer and Wagner, eventually rejecting their ideas in favor of his own radical vision. His break with these two mentors marked a decisive turning point in his intellectual journey, as he moved beyond their influence to develop his own original critique of morality, power, and human existence. Nietzsche first encountered Schopenhauer's philosophy while studying at the University of Leipzig in 1865. Schopenhauer's seminal work, The World as Will and Representation, had a profound impact on the young scholar, who was captivated by its dark and pessimistic view of the world. Schopenhauer argued that the fundamental driving force of existence was an irrational, blind force he called the will to life, an insatiable and purposeless striving that condemned all living beings to suffering. For Schopenhauer, human existence was marked by perpetual dissatisfaction, and the only escape from this cycle of suffering was through asceticism, aesthetic contemplation, and a renunciation of worldly desires. Nietzsche initially embraced Schopenhauer's worldview, finding in it a powerful explanation for the human condition. The notion of the will as the underlying force of existence resonated with him, and he admired Schopenhauer's critique of traditional metaphysics and religion. However, Nietzsche would later come to reject Schopenhauer's pessimism and his advocacy for ascetic withdrawal from life. Instead of renouncing the world, Nietzsche sought to affirm life in all its complexity, struggle, and suffering. This fundamental difference in perspective would lead him to develop his own concept of the will to power, which, unlike Schopenhauer's will to life, was not a force of suffering, but one of creative energy, self-overcoming, and mastery. At the same time, Nietzsche's relationship with Richard Wagner was developing along a parallel trajectory. Wagner was one of the most celebrated composers of the 19th century, known for his ambitious operas that sought to unite music, drama, and mythology into a total work of art. Nietzsche first met Wagner in 1868, and the two quickly formed a close friendship. Wagner saw Nietzsche as an intellectual ally, while Nietzsche admired Wagner's artistic genius and his vision of reviving the grandeur of ancient Greek tragedy. Their shared interest in art, mythology, and German culture cemented their bond, and for a time, Nietzsche was one of Wagner's most enthusiastic supporters. Nietzsche's admiration for Wagner was most evident in his first major work, The Birth of Tragedy, 1872, in which he argued that Wagner's music represented the rebirth of the Dionysian spirit in modern art. According to Nietzsche, ancient Greek tragedy had successfully balanced the opposing forces of the Apollonian, order, rationality, and structure, and the Dionysian, chaos, passion, and ecstasy. However, with the rise of Socratic rationalism, this balance had been lost, leading to the decline of artistic and cultural vitality. Nietzsche saw Wagner as the key to restoring this lost harmony, believing that his operas could revive the Dionysian element in modern culture. However, Nietzsche's relationship with Wagner began to sour in the mid-1870s. One of the primary reasons for this rupture was Wagner's increasing nationalism and his embrace of Christianity in his later works. Nietzsche, who was becoming more critical of both nationalism and religion, found Wagner's ideological shift deeply troubling. He had once seen Wagner as a revolutionary artist who could challenge the stagnation of contemporary culture, but he now viewed him as a reactionary figure who had abandoned his radical artistic vision in favor of conservative and religious ideals. The breaking point came with Wagner's opera Parsifal, 1882, which was infused with Christian themes of redemption and salvation. Nietzsche saw this as a betrayal of everything he had admired in Wagner, viewing it as a retreat into the very religious morality he sought to overcome. His disillusionment with Wagner was also personal. He had once considered Wagner a kindred spirit, only to realize that their paths had diverged irreconcilably. Nietzsche's later works, particularly The Case of Wagner, 1888, and Nietzsche contra Wagner, 1889, would serve as scathing critiques of the composer, accusing him of decadence, manipulation, and artistic decline. Nietzsche's break with Wagner was not just the end of a friendship. It was a symbolic rejection of his own past influences. By distancing himself from both Schopenhauer and Wagner, Nietzsche was asserting his intellectual independence and clearing the way for his own philosophical innovations. His rejection of Schopenhauer's pessimism led him to develop a philosophy that emphasized self-overcoming, strength, and the affirmation of life. His disillusionment with Wagner pushed him to critique not just modern art, but also the broader cultural and moral values that he saw as decayed and lifeless. Despite their eventual estrangement, both Schopenhauer and Wagner left an indelible mark on Nietzsche's thought. Schopenhauer introduced him to the idea of a fundamental driving force behind existence, which Nietzsche would later reinterpret in his own way. Wagner, meanwhile, demonstrated the power of art and mythology to shape culture, even if Nietzsche ultimately rejected his vision. In many ways, Nietzsche's own philosophy can be seen as a response to these two figures. He did not merely discard their ideas, but transformed them into something entirely his own. Nietzsche's break with tradition marked the beginning of a new phase in his intellectual journey. No longer bound by the influences of his mentors, he was free to develop his own radical ideas about morality, power, and human potential. His critiques of Schopenhauer and Wagner were not acts of mere rebellion, but necessary steps in the evolution of his thought. As he moved forward, Nietzsche would go on to challenge the very foundations of Western philosophy, religion, and morality, setting the stage for his most revolutionary works. With his intellectual independence firmly established, Friedrich Nietzsche turned his attention to one of the central concerns of his philosophy: the critique of morality. For Nietzsche, morality was not an absolute, divine law, but a historically contingent construct that had evolved through power struggles, cultural shifts, and psychological needs. His analysis of morality was not merely an abstract philosophical exercise, but a radical reevaluation of the values that had shaped Western civilization for centuries. Through his works, particularly Beyond Good and Evil, 1886, and On the Genealogy of Morality, 1887, Nietzsche sought to deconstruct traditional moral values and reveal the underlying forces that had given rise to them. At the heart of Nietzsche's moral philosophy was his distinction between two fundamental types of morality: master morality and slave morality. He argued that in ancient societies, morality was originally defined by the ruling classes, who saw their own qualities, strength, power, nobility, and self-affirmation, as inherently good. This master morality was based on the values of those who were dominant, valuing life, creativity, and excellence. In contrast, slave morality emerged as a response from the oppressed classes, who, unable to compete with the powerful, redefined morality in terms of weakness, humility, and submission. The result was the moral inversion of values. What was once seen as strong and noble became evil, while what was weak and submissive was recast as good. Nietzsche saw the rise of Christianity as the most profound triumph of slave morality. He argued that Christianity took the resentment, ressentiment, of the weak and institutionalized it into a moral system that glorified suffering, obedience, and meekness. The Christian ethic of turning the other cheek, loving one's enemies, and valuing self-sacrifice, Nietzsche claimed, was not an expression of divine truth, but a strategy of the powerless to subvert the powerful. By portraying suffering as virtuous and condemning pride and ambition, Christianity ensured the dominance of slave morality over Western culture for centuries. Nietzsche's critique of Christian morality was not merely an attack on religion. It was an attack on a broader system of values that had, in his view, stifled human potential. He saw traditional morality as life-denying, promoting guilt, fear, and a suppression of natural instincts. The emphasis on duty, self-denial, and the afterlife discouraged individuals from embracing life fully and striving for greatness. This, Nietzsche argued, had led to a cultural and psychological decline, fostering mediocrity rather than excellence. One of Nietzsche's most controversial claims was that moral values were not eternal truths, but rather expressions of the will to power, the fundamental drive that motivates all living beings. Morality, in this sense, was not about objective right and wrong, but about the imposition of one group's values over another. The weak, unable to assert their power directly, created moral systems that undermined the strong, ensuring their own survival. Nietzsche's task, as he saw it, was to expose this dynamic and challenge the assumption that traditional morality was beyond question. In On the Genealogy of Morality, Nietzsche provided a historical analysis of how moral concepts evolved over time. He argued that concepts like guilt and conscience did not originate from divine commands or rational reflection, but from social and economic structures. Early societies, he claimed, functioned on a system of credit and debt, where justice was initially based on retribution rather than abstract moral principles. As religious institutions gained power, they transformed these notions of debt and punishment into moral obligations, making people feel eternally guilty before God. This internalization of guilt, Nietzsche believed, led to the development of what he called bad conscience, a psychological state in which individuals turn their natural instincts against themselves, leading to self-punishment and repression. Nietzsche did not simply reject traditional morality. He sought to replace it with a new way of thinking. His concept of perspectivism suggested that there are no absolute moral truths, only different perspectives shaped by cultural, historical, and personal factors. This did not mean that all moral values were equal, but rather that individuals must critically examine the values they inherit and determine which serve the enhancement of life and which hinder it. He called for a revaluation of all values, urging individuals to create their own moral codes rather than blindly following inherited traditions. This call for a new morality was closely tied to Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch, Overman or Superman, which he introduced in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. The Übermensch was an individual who transcended traditional moral constraints and created his own values, embracing life with strength, creativity, and self-determination. Nietzsche saw this as the next step in human evolution, where individuals would no longer be bound by outdated religious or societal norms, but would instead affirm life in its fullest expression. Nietzsche's critique of morality was radical and unsettling, challenging some of the deepest assumptions of Western thought. His ideas were often misunderstood, leading to accusations of nihilism and amorality. However, Nietzsche was not advocating for the destruction of all values, but rather for the rejection of values that diminished human potential. He sought to free individuals from the weight of inherited guilt and repression, allowing them to live more authentically and powerfully. As Nietzsche's ideas evolved, his attack on morality became more forceful, culminating in his famous declaration of the death of God. For Nietzsche, this was not merely a statement about religion, but about the collapse of the entire moral framework built upon the belief in divine authority. Without God, traditional morality could no longer sustain itself, and humanity was left with the task of creating new values. This challenge, Nietzsche believed, was both terrifying and liberating, marking the beginning of a new era in human thought. One of Friedrich Nietzsche's most famous and provocative ideas is the declaration that God is dead. This statement, which appears in The Gay Science, 1882, and is further developed in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, 1883 to 1885, is not merely a rejection of religious belief, but a diagnosis of the deep cultural and existential crisis facing modern civilization. Nietzsche's proclamation is not a triumphalist statement celebrating atheism, but rather a profound recognition that the decline of religious faith leaves humanity without a stable foundation for meaning and morality. The death of God, for Nietzsche, signified the collapse of the values that had shaped Western thought for centuries, forcing humanity to confront the terrifying question of what comes next. Nietzsche's declaration that God is dead must be understood within the context of European intellectual history. For centuries, Christianity had provided a coherent moral and metaphysical system that structured human life, giving individuals a sense of purpose and a framework for distinguishing good from evil. However, with the rise of scientific discoveries, historical criticism of religious texts, and the secularization of society, faith in this system began to erode. Nietzsche saw the growing dominance of rationalism, materialism, and skepticism as signs that traditional religious beliefs could no longer sustain themselves in the modern world. Yet Nietzsche was not content with simply pointing out the decline of religion. He was deeply concerned with its consequences. He feared that without the foundation provided by Christianity, Western civilization would drift into nihilism, the belief that life has no inherent meaning, purpose, or value. If the old moral order was built upon the existence of God, then the death of God left humanity in a void, facing the terrifying prospect that all values were arbitrary and that life itself lacked direction. This, Nietzsche believed, was the most pressing existential crisis of his time. Nietzsche's concern with nihilism was not just theoretical. He saw it manifesting in the cultural and intellectual trends of modern Europe. He believed that many so-called atheists and secular thinkers had not fully grasped the implications of their own rejection of God. While they no longer believed in divine authority, they continued to cling to Christian moral values, as if those values could stand independently without their religious foundation. Nietzsche criticized this intellectual inconsistency, arguing that if God was truly dead, then morality itself had to be re-evaluated from the ground up. One of Nietzsche's most powerful metaphors for the death of God appears in The Gay Science, where he describes a madman running through a marketplace, proclaiming, "God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves? the murderers of all murderers. The madman's frantic questioning reflects Nietzsche's concern that humanity was not prepared for the consequences of this realization. By declaring that we have killed him, Nietzsche emphasized that the death of God was not an external event, but a result of human actions. Our growing reliance on science, reason, and secularism had led to the erosion of religious faith. However, instead of celebrating this loss, Nietzsche warned that humanity would have to face the abyss of meaninglessness and either succumb to despair or create new values to replace the old ones. To Nietzsche, the problem of nihilism was not just a loss of belief in God, but the potential paralysis that could result from it. If people no longer believed in a higher purpose, they might retreat into passive resignation, seeking comfort in distractions, hedonism, or conformity. Nietzsche saw this passive nihilism as a dangerous outcome, one that could lead to cultural stagnation and the decline of human greatness. Instead of succumbing to despair, he called for a radical revaluation of values, one that would allow humanity to forge a new path beyond traditional morality and religious dogma. Nietzsche's solution to the crisis of meaning was the concept of the Übermensch, Overman or Superman, introduced in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. The Übermensch was not a specific individual, but an ideal, one who creates his own values, embraces life in its fullest intensity, and overcomes the constraints of traditional morality. Instead of relying on external authorities to define meaning, the Übermensch takes responsibility for shaping his own existence. In this way, Nietzsche's response to nihilism was not hopelessness, but an affirmation of life's creative possibilities. Yet, Nietzsche recognized that the transition from the death of God to the emergence of the Übermensch would not be immediate. He predicted that humanity would first pass through an age of deep uncertainty and existential struggle. In the absence of divine authority, people might seek new forms of dogma, whether in nationalism, ideology, or materialism, to fill the void left by religion. Nietzsche warned against these substitutes, arguing that they would only perpetuate the same psychological dependency that religion had created. Instead, he urged individuals to cultivate inner strength, intellectual courage, and a willingness to embrace life's uncertainties. Nietzsche's ideas about the death of God have had a profound influence on modern existentialist thought. Later philosophers such as Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, and Martin Heidegger engaged deeply with Nietzsche's critique of meaning and sought their own answers to the challenge of nihilism. While Nietzsche's radical vision of the Übermensch remains controversial, his insights into the psychological and cultural consequences of losing religious faith continue to resonate in contemporary discussions about meaning, morality, and human purpose. Ultimately, Nietzsche's declaration of the death of God was not just a statement about religion, but a call to action. He saw it as both a danger and an opportunity, an invitation for humanity to move beyond inherited beliefs and actively create new values. His challenge remains relevant today. In a world where traditional certainties continue to erode, Nietzsche's philosophy urges us to confront the unknown with courage, creativity, and a commitment to self-overcoming. As Friedrich Nietzsche moved beyond traditional morality and the crumbling foundations of religious faith, he sought to articulate a new guiding principle for human existence. This principle, which he called the will to power, became one of the central ideas in his philosophy. For Nietzsche, life was not driven by mere survival or rationality, as other philosophers had suggested, but by a deeper and more fundamental force, the striving for power, dominance, and self-overcoming. The will to power was not just a theory of human behavior, but a radical reinterpretation of existence itself, challenging conventional ideas about motivation, ethics, and the nature of reality. Nietzsche's will to power must be understood as a response to the problem of nihilism. With the death of God and the collapse of traditional moral systems, humanity was left with the daunting task of redefining its purpose. Nietzsche rejected the idea that life had an inherent meaning given from above. Instead, he argued that meaning must be actively created. The will to power was his answer to the existential void. It was not about submission or resignation, but about the creative force that drives individuals to impose their own values on the world. Unlike Arthur Schopenhauer's will to life, which portrayed existence as a blind struggle for survival and a cycle of suffering. Nietzsche's will to power was an affirmative force. He saw it as the essence of all life, from the biological level to the psychological and cultural. Every organism, Nietzsche argued, is not simply trying to survive but to expand, grow, and assert itself. Plants compete for sunlight, animals struggle for dominance, and human beings seek to impose their will on their environment. Power, in this sense, was not merely political or physical strength, but the capacity to shape the world according to one's own vision. One of the most misunderstood aspects of Nietzsche's will to power is the idea that it advocates for brute domination or tyranny. While Nietzsche did acknowledge that power struggles exist at all levels of life, he was not promoting violence or oppression as an ethical ideal. Instead, he saw the will to power as a broader concept, an internal drive towards self-mastery, creativity, and the overcoming of limitations. The highest expression of power, in Nietzsche's view, was not subjugating others but transforming oneself into a stronger and more refined being. In this sense, the will to power was closely linked to Nietzsche's idea of the Übermensch. The Übermensch was the individual who fully embraced the will to power, rejecting passive conformity and weak moral systems in favor of self-creation and excellence. Instead of being bound by traditional notions of good and evil, the Übermensch defined his own values and lived with an intense affirmation of life. This, for Nietzsche, was the path beyond nihilism, not the retreat into despair, but the active engagement with existence as a challenge to be overcome. Nietzsche's critique of democracy, socialism, and herd morality was deeply connected to his concept of the will to power. He believed that many modern political and social movements, despite claiming to promote equality and justice, were actually manifestations of weakness, attempts by the masses to suppress the strong and exceptional. In his view, democratic and egalitarian ideals often concealed a deeper resentment, ressentiment, toward those who excelled, seeking to level society by punishing greatness rather than encouraging it. Instead of striving for collective mediocrity, Nietzsche called for the cultivation of exceptional individuals who could push humanity forward. This perspective has made Nietzsche's philosophy both influential and controversial. Some have interpreted his ideas as a justification for elitism, while others have seen them as a call for personal transformation and self-overcoming. What remains clear is that Nietzsche was deeply skeptical of any system, political, religious, or philosophical, that sought to impose a single, universal moral code on humanity. He believed that strength came not from obedience to external rules, but from the inner drive to grow, experiment, and surpass oneself. Nietzsche also extended the will to power beyond the individual and into broader cultural and intellectual realms. He saw art, philosophy, and science as expressions of this drive, each representing different ways in which humanity seeks to impose order and meaning on the chaos of existence. Great artists, thinkers, and leaders, in his view, were those who channeled their will to power into creative expression, shaping the world through their unique vision. He admired figures such as Goethe, Napoleon, and even himself as examples of individuals who embodied this principle. However, Nietzsche also recognized the dangers of the will to power. When misdirected, it could lead to destructive impulses, fanaticism, or the mindless pursuit of domination. He warned against nihilistic forces that might corrupt this principle, those who, instead of using their power creatively, sought only to destroy or manipulate others. The true challenge of the will to power, then, was not simply to gain control over the external world, but to master oneself, to transform one's desires into something higher and more meaningful. Nietzsche's will to power was a call to action, a rejection of passivity and weakness in favor of strength, creativity, and self-overcoming. It was a philosophy of affirmation, urging individuals to embrace life's struggles not as burdens, but as opportunities for growth. In a world where traditional values were collapsing, Nietzsche believed that the only way forward was to seize the reins of existence and shape one's own destiny. His vision remains a powerful challenge to modern thought, inspiring those who seek to rise above mediocrity and affirm life with a fierce and unyielding intensity. Among Friedrich Nietzsche's most enigmatic and profound ideas is the concept of eternal recurrence. Introduced in *The Gay Science*, 1882, and further explored in *Thus Spoke Zarathustra*, 1883 to 1885, this thought experiment serves as both a metaphysical hypothesis and an ethical challenge. The idea of eternal recurrence posits that every moment of life, every action, and every experience will be repeated infinitely in an identical manner. While seemingly abstract, Nietzsche presents this notion as the ultimate test of whether one truly affirms life. If one could joyfully accept the idea of reliving one's life eternally with all its triumphs and sufferings, then one has achieved the highest form of existence. Nietzsche does not introduce eternal recurrence as a scientific theory, but as a psychological and existential challenge. Imagine, he asks, that a demon appears and declares that every event in one's life will repeat in the exact same sequence forever. How would one respond to this revelation? For Nietzsche, the reaction to this question reveals an individual's relationship with life. If one recoils in horror, seeing existence as a burden, then one has not yet fully embraced life. If, however, one welcomes this fate joyfully, then one has attained a rare form of life affirmation. The idea of eternal recurrence is closely tied to Nietzsche's rejection of nihilism. In a world where God is dead and absolute meaning is absent, individuals face the risk of seeing life as meaningless and transient. Eternal recurrence forces one to reconsider this perspective. If every moment is destined to return eternally, then each action gains immense significance. Every choice, every joy, and every suffering is no longer a fleeting occurrence, but part of an infinite cycle. Thus, one must live as though each moment will be repeated endlessly, taking full responsibility for one's existence. Nietzsche's emphasis on eternal recurrence also reflects his broader critique of moral and religious doctrines that devalue earthly life. Many traditional belief systems encourage people to endure suffering in the hope of an afterlife, seeing the present world as temporary and insignificant. Nietzsche challenges this view by asking individuals to embrace life completely, without escape or consolation. If one knew that this life would recur infinitely, there would be no excuse to postpone happiness or fulfillment. Instead, one would have to find meaning and joy in the present moment. There is also a profound connection between eternal recurrence and the will to power. Both concepts emphasize the necessity of self-overcoming and personal strength. The will to power drives individuals to assert themselves and shape their own values, while eternal recurrence forces them to take full ownership of their actions. Together, these ideas form a framework in which true greatness is achieved not through external rewards, but through an intense engagement with life itself. The greatest individuals, Nietzsche argues, are those who could look upon their lives and say, "Yes, I would live this again and again." However, eternal recurrence is not an easy philosophy to accept. It demands an extraordinary level of courage and self-honesty. Many people, when faced with the thought of reliving their lives eternally, would be filled with regret or despair. This reaction, for Nietzsche, is an indication that one has not yet truly embraced existence. The challenge of eternal recurrence is to live in such a way that one would welcome infinite repetition, not as a curse, but as a testament to the joy and intensity of one's life. Nietzsche's idea of eternal recurrence also has implications for ethics. Traditional moral systems often base their values on external rewards or punishments, whether divine judgment or societal approval. Nietzsche rejects these frameworks and instead suggests a more personal and existential approach. Act in such a way that you would be willing to live with the consequences of your actions eternally. This shifts moral responsibility from an external authority to the individual, demanding a radical form of self-accountability. Philosophers and scholars have debated whether Nietzsche intended eternal recurrence to be taken as a literal cosmological theory. Some interpretations suggest that he viewed it as a hypothesis about the nature of time and existence, influenced by his readings in physics. Others argue that it is purely a psychological test, a thought experiment designed to awaken individuals to the intensity of their own existence. Regardless of its metaphysical status, eternal recurrence remains one of Nietzsche's most provocative and challenging ideas. The influence of eternal recurrence extends beyond philosophy into literature, psychology, and even modern existentialist thought. Writers such as Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre engage with Nietzsche's challenge, exploring the tension between meaninglessness and the affirmation of life. Psychologists have also drawn on eternal recurrence as a tool for self-examination, encouraging individuals to reflect on whether they are truly living in alignment with their deepest values. Eternal recurrence is Nietzsche's way of asking the most fundamental question: do you love life enough to live it again, exactly as it is? For those who can answer with an unhesitating yes, Nietzsche offers the highest form of affirmation. In a world without guarantees, without divine order, and without absolute truths, eternal recurrence stands as the ultimate measure of a life well lived, one that embraces every joy and suffering with unwavering strength. Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophy is deeply rooted in a radical critique of modernity, which he saw as a period of decline, weakness, and spiritual decay. His dissatisfaction with the modern world was not merely cultural or political, it was existential. He believed that the values shaping modern society, egalitarianism, democracy, Christianity, and scientific rationalism, had contributed to the weakening of the human spirit. At the heart of his critique lies the concept of herd morality, a set of values and beliefs that he saw as promoting conformity, mediocrity, and the suppression of individual greatness. Nietzsche argued that modernity had inherited a moral system built on Christian and democratic ideals that prioritized equality, compassion, and self-sacrifice. While these values are often considered virtues, Nietzsche saw them as symptoms of ressentiment, a deep-seated resentment of strength and excellence. He believed that traditional morality was not a reflection of universal truth, but a psychological strategy employed by the weak to subdue the strong. According to Nietzsche, the rise of Christianity had marked a decisive turning point, replacing an earlier master morality with a slave morality that glorified passivity and submission. In contrast to slave morality, which is based on humility and self-denial, Nietzsche described master morality as the value system of the strong, noble, and self-affirming individuals who determine their own values. In pre-Christian societies, the aristocratic class did not define morality in terms of good and evil, but rather in terms of strength and weakness. The noble regarded himself as good because he embodied power, vitality, and creativity, while he viewed the weak and passive as inferior. However, with the rise of Christianity and democratic ideals, Nietzsche argued, the weak turned morality into a weapon, demonizing strength and asserting their own victimhood as a form of virtue. Nietzsche saw modernity as a continuation of this moral inversion. He believed that democratic societies, with their emphasis on equality and the collective good, suppress the potential of the truly exceptional individual. In his view, the masses, whom he referred to as the herd, preferred security and comfort over greatness and self-overcoming. Herd morality, he argued, discourages independent thought and seeks to eliminate the differences between individuals by imposing a universal standard of mediocrity. One of Nietzsche's sharpest critiques was directed at the way modern institutions, whether religious, political, or educational, reinforced herd morality. He saw Christianity as a doctrine that encouraged guilt and self-denial, discouraging people from embracing their instincts and passions. Similarly, he viewed democracy and socialism as systems that prioritized collective well-being over individual excellence, fostering a culture of dependency rather than one of self-mastery. Even scientific rationalism, despite its rejection of religious dogma, was not spared from Nietzsche's criticism. He believed that an excessive reliance on reason and objectivity could lead to a mechanical view of life, stripping existence of its passion, creativity, and mystery. Nietzsche's critique of modernity also extended to the intellectual and cultural life of his time. He despised what he saw as the increasing commercialization of art and philosophy, where creativity was no longer an expression of profound vision, but a product tailored to public consumption. He lamented the decline of truly great thinkers and artists, arguing that modern culture favored conformity over genius. For Nietzsche, the modern world was suffocating under the weight of its own mediocrity, unwilling to foster the conditions necessary for the emergence of extraordinary individuals. One of the consequences of herd morality, according to Nietzsche, is the rise of what he called the last man. The last man represents the ultimate culmination of modernity's weaknesses, a comfortable, risk-averse, and spiritually empty individual who seeks nothing beyond personal security and trivial pleasures. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche describes the last man as one who has no aspirations, no grand ambitions, and no desire for self-overcoming. Instead of striving for greatness, the last man is content with an easy, predictable existence. Nietzsche saw this as the fate of a society that prioritizes comfort over challenge and equality over excellence. Yet Nietzsche did not merely diagnose the problems of modernity. He also sought a way forward. He saw the overcoming of herd morality as essential to the evolution of humanity. Instead of passively accepting the values imposed by society, Nietzsche urged individuals to engage in a radical reevaluation of values. Umwertung aller Wert, revaluation of all values. This meant rejecting inherited moralities and forging one's own path, embracing struggle and self-overcoming rather than seeking external validation. He believed that only through this process could individuals escape the constraints of herd morality and ascend toward the ideal of the Übermensch. Nietzsche's critique of modernity remains highly relevant today. In an era where mass culture, consumerism, and digital technology shape human behavior, many of his concerns about herd mentality and the suppression of individuality continue to resonate. His call for self-overcoming challenges individuals to resist the passive comforts of modern life and to take responsibility for shaping their own existence. While his rejection of traditional morality has sparked controversy, his critique of conformity and mediocrity has inspired generations of thinkers, artists, and cultural critics. Nietzsche's vision was not one of despair, but of potential. He did not merely lament the state of modern humanity. He sought to inspire those capable of transcending it. The struggle against herd morality is not easy, but for Nietzsche, it is the only path to true greatness. In a world where the last man threatens to dominate, Nietzsche's philosophy serves as a call to arms, a demand for strength, creativity, and an uncompromising affirmation of life. Friedrich Nietzsche's profound critique of Western philosophy, his rejection of traditional values, and his call for a radical revaluation of life left an indelible mark on the intellectual landscape of the modern era. Though his ideas were often controversial and at times misunderstood, Nietzsche's legacy has continued to shape philosophical discourse, literature, psychology, and even popular culture. His influence permeates not only existentialism and postmodernism, but also contemporary thought in a variety of fields, challenging individuals to reconsider the meaning of existence, morality, and the self. At the heart of Nietzsche's philosophical revolution lies his rejection of metaphysical and religious systems that, in his view, suppressed human potential. He argued that Christianity, in particular, with its emphasis on humility, meekness, and the afterlife, was responsible for the decline of individual strength and creativity. By proclaiming that God is dead, Nietzsche was not making a theological statement, but rather observing the collapse of the moral and metaphysical frameworks that had once underpinned Western society. This, for him, was both a tragedy and an opportunity, a chance to free humanity from the shackles of dogma and to embrace life on its own terms. Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch, Overman or Superman, remains one of his most enduring and provocative ideas. The Übermensch represents the ideal individual who transcends conventional morality and creates his own values. This figure is not merely a powerful or intelligent person, but someone who possesses the strength to affirm life in its entirety, including its suffering and struggles. The Übermensch embraces the idea of self-overcoming, constantly evolving and redefining himself. In this sense, Nietzsche's Übermensch can be seen as a response to the nihilistic void left by the decline of religious certainty, a figure who fills the emptiness with creativity, strength, and joy. One of the most striking aspects of Nietzsche's legacy is the degree to which his ideas influenced existentialist thinkers such as Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, and Martin Heidegger. Nietzsche's exploration of the human condition, especially his emphasis on individual freedom and self-determination, provided a foundation for existentialism. Sartre, for example, shared Nietzsche's conviction that existence precedes essence, and that individuals must take responsibility for creating their own meaning in a world devoid of inherent purpose. Nietzsche's challenge to embrace life's absurdities and to create meaning despite a lack of universal values resonated strongly with Camus' idea of the myth of Sisyphus, where the struggle itself, rather than any final resolution, becomes the source of meaning. Nietzsche's critique of modernity and herd morality also paved the way for the development of postmodern philosophy. Thinkers like Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, and Gilles Deleuze were deeply influenced by Nietzsche's rejection of universal truths and grand narratives. Foucault, for instance, adopted Nietzsche's genealogical method to trace the historical development of power and knowledge, examining how dominant ideologies shape societal norms and individual behavior. Nietzsche's emphasis on the fluidity of values and the importance of power dynamics became central to postmodern critiques of modern institutions, including politics, law, and science. In addition to his philosophical impact, Nietzsche's ideas have reverberated throughout literature and the arts. Writers such as Thomas Mann, Hermann Hesse, and even the existential poets and novelists of the 20th century have drawn inspiration from Nietzsche's vision of the individual who dares to live authentically in the face of a chaotic world. His exploration of the tensions between instinct and reason, creativity and destruction, has provided fertile ground for literary works that grapple with the complexities of the human condition. Nietzsche's aphoristic style, with its paradoxical and provocative statements, has also influenced the development of literary modernism and has inspired writers to explore fragmented narratives, shifting perspectives, and the ambiguity of meaning. Nietzsche's legacy has also made its way into the realm of psychology, particularly through the work of Carl Jung. Jung, who was initially influenced by Nietzsche, incorporated many of Nietzsche's ideas into his own exploration of the unconscious, the self, and the process of individuation. Nietzsche's concept of self-overcoming was seen by Jung as a model for the individual's journey toward wholeness. Jung's notion of the shadow, the darker, repressed aspects of the self, echoes Nietzsche's exploration of the tension between life-affirming instincts and the moral constraints of society. Nietzsche's emphasis on strength, vitality, and the will to power provided a psychological framework for understanding the dynamics of personal growth and transformation. Despite his lasting influence, Nietzsche's ideas have also been misinterpreted and misused. One of the most infamous appropriations of Nietzsche's work occurred in the early 20th century, when the Nazi regime distorted his philosophy to justify their ideology of racial superiority and authoritarian rule. Nietzsche's sister, Elisabeth Forster Nietzsche, who was sympathetic to nationalist and anti-Semitic views, played a significant role in editing and misrepresenting his work in ways that aligned with the Nazis' agenda. However, Nietzsche himself was fiercely critical of anti-Semitism, nationalism, and totalitarianism. His philosophy, with its emphasis on the affirmation of life and the rejection of herd morality, is fundamentally at odds with the principles of fascism. Nietzsche's work has also provoked criticism from those who view his philosophy as overly individualistic or even nihilistic. Some have argued that Nietzsche's rejection of universal values leads to moral relativism, where anything can be justified by the will to power. Others have suggested that his philosophy, with its focus on strength and self-assertion, could lead to dangerous forms of elitism or social Darwinism. Nietzsche's provocative nature, combined with the radical implications of his ideas, has made his work a battleground for philosophical debate. Yet, despite these criticisms and misinterpretations, Nietzsche's legacy remains as vital as ever. His call for a life-affirming philosophy that embraces struggle, creativity, and self-overcoming continues to resonate with those who seek meaning in an increasingly fragmented and uncertain world. Nietzsche's challenge to live authentically, to create one's own values, and to rise above the constraints of conventional morality is as relevant today as it was in the 19th century. His vision of the Übermensch, the individual who transcends the herd and creates his own path, offers a radical alternative to the conformity and mediocrity that often characterize modern life. In the end, Nietzsche's greatest contribution lies not in providing answers to life's ultimate questions, but in encouraging individuals to ask the difficult questions and to live with the intensity and courage required to confront them. His work is a call to embrace life in all its complexity, to challenge existing norms, and to strive for greatness. Nietzsche's philosophy, though often unsettling, is ultimately a philosophy of hope, a hope that human beings can overcome the limitations imposed by society, religion, and history to create a future that is richer, more meaningful, and more profoundly human.